All right, I'm in Ephesians chapter 6. Ephesians chapter 6, talking about the relationship between the parent and the child, between a servant and a master, those kinds of things. These are different relationships than what he described at the end of chapter 5. At the end of chapter 5, he spoke about the marital relationship between a husband and a wife. The relationship between children and parents is much different. Beginning in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 1, he says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with you and you may live long on the earth. And you fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord." And then he speaks about bondservants, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. All right, so he speaks about the relationship between children and parents, and that children are to obey their parents, and their parents ought to be careful not to provoke their children. That's effectively what he gets at. And that these are things that people will be encouraged to do with one another as they grow in the Lord. When it comes to children, though, in general, we don't consider children to be people who know the Lord. They definitely don't start out that way. They don't start out coming into this world as a little baby saying, "Praise Jesus." That's not what goes on. So it takes some time for the person to grow, and of course they end up learning a whole lot of dysfunctional ways of relating to other people, and then they have to consider the things of God and believe that there is a God. Well, if there is, what has he had to say? What has he done? What does he expect? Those are the kinds of questions that have to be addressed, and they take time. They just simply take time. When a person is an adult, they will still need to take time to work through these issues if they ever decide that these issues are going to have any importance to them at all. Most do not feel that these issues have any importance to them. And so to speak with people about obey as to the Lord, that does not have a lot of meaning to most people because they don't have any kind of recognition of God or any relationship of God with God in any significant way. So those are some things that I'll need to address. But when it comes to the relationship between parent and a child, there are some general ways that this can be understood and how you can see why Paul would encourage people to relate to one another in this way. I'm going to approach this by saying that the parent has certain responsibilities in this relationship, and the child also has certain responsibilities in this relationship. Okay? The objective of a parent with a child, the general objective, is to prepare the child to become an adult. All right? That's the purpose of the parent. That's the objective of the parent, is in what way are they going to prepare their child to become an adult. And the child has the responsibility of learning how to become an adult. All right. Now, of course, there are a lot of other little things that we could talk about in terms of what is the responsibility of the parent and responsibility of the child. But I'm going to pick on these two items. That the parent has the responsibility to help the child learn how to be an adult, and the child has a responsibility to learn how to be an adult. That this is a purpose. This is a fundamental objective of the relationship between a parent and a child. This relationship is going to be a temporary relationship. Eventually, they are not going to be together. Okay? At some point, there will be a separation between the parent and the child. This normally happens when the child departs from the home. In some circumstances, the child never departs from the home, in which case the parents eventually die. And then there is a separation between the parents and the children. And the children are going to have to figure out how to be an adult. How are they going to make it? What are they going to do? How are they going to participate in civilization? Because they don't have their parent to take care of them anymore. And the longer it takes for a person to work through these issues, the more difficult it is to work through these issues. And if there's not a lot of time left in the child's life after they're confronted with these things, they may not have enough time in order to end their lives peacefully, to say it that way. All right, but the parent generally has this responsibility that is what they are there for, is to prepare their children to be an adult. Now, of course, this is not as common as we would like. In many cases, parents do not relate to their children in that way. They are not fulfilling their responsibility in that regard, either because they don't know how themselves, they really don't know how to be adults themselves very well. Maybe in a lot of dysfunctional ways, but not in really good functional ways. And they don't necessarily want to teach their children, although some do. They don't necessarily want to teach their children how to be dysfunctional because they don't want to have to deal with too many relational issues with their kids. But even if a parent does not fulfill their responsibility in this regard, the child still has the responsibility of learning how to become an adult. And if they can't get much insight into that from their parents, then they have to get it from somewhere else, from somebody else. They will have to pursue that, or they will suffer much more than they should, or that they would otherwise. So this is why I believe Paul refers to this kind of relationship in this way, where he says that children, you are to obey your parents, for this is right. You obey them because they are preparing you to become an adult. That's the expectation. You don't just obey your parents just because they demand obedience. That's not going to solve this kind of a problem. All right, and learning how to become a functional adult is a problem to solve. All of life can be defined as a set of problems that each person needs to solve. And we look for the solutions that don't create new problems. But there are a lot of solutions that people utilize that do create more problems. And while they may solve something immediately, they create huge problems later on. That's part of the struggle that people face when they are making decisions about how they're going to relate to other people. But either way, people have to figure out and they have to learn how to solve the general problems of life. Okay, so what would be expected of a child to become an adult? What would be expected of them? There are 4 different categories that I would divide this up into. The first category is that they need to rest. They need to know how to rest, because our physiology is not designed to live without any rest of any kind. So we want to understand what rest is and how it's applied and what it's for and what are good ways of resting and bad ways of resting. This is an important problem of life, of how we're going to prepare ourselves to do things that we are not going to want to do. Okay, so resting usually has to do with things that we would like to do, things that do not necessarily have any associated purpose or objective or goal, and that this is good for us in the sense that we do need to have some rest of some kind. But in general, the purpose of this is to prepare you for the next category, which is to work. All right? Everybody has to work in one way or another. And in general, work is understood as doing those things that you don't want to do. Okay? It's a fundamental part of life that we do have to do things that we do not want to do. And in many ways, that could be described as a skill. It's something that a person has to learn. They have to learn the importance of doing things they do not want to do. And usually it's because there are things that they want to do, and they have to do things they don't want to do before they can do the things that they have to do, or that they want to do. All right. So, so work is an important part of life. And, you probably noticed if you have children that they're not into that right away. They're not into that. The idea of doing something that they don't want to do. Well, there are a lot of ways that people discover in order to avoid doing things that they don't want to do because it makes them feel uncomfortable. All right. So there is a place for being comfortable in rest, and there is a place for being uncomfortable in work. And that you have to be able to function in both areas, function well, and and contribute to your society in a way that they are able to trade with you. Okay. And that just simply is associated with work. The next category is eating. Okay. A person needs to eat. And there are some options concerning how a person can eat. They can eat poorly or they can eat well. All right. And this is an important part of life that most people don't do very well at. But it is important, and it would be expected of a parent to teach their children how to eat well. Okay? In most cases, people eat according to whatever makes them feel good at the moment. All right? Whatever tastes good, whatever makes them feel good, whatever's convenient. That's a big one right there. Just whatever's convenient, as opposed to giving the body what it needs to function properly and not encourage disease, all right, and dysfunction. And it turns out that most disease and dysfunction is a consequence of what people put in their mouths. All right, this is a big deal. It really is. And it's something that a parent should teach their children. And like I said, it's not common. And so, it could be that a lot of parents just don't know or they don't want to go through the effort. There's lots of reasons why this doesn't happen. But the children are still going to have to assume responsibility for what they eat for themselves as well. And this is an important category of life. So, you've probably seen these struggles if you're familiar with parent-child relationships in your own life, then you've seen these kinds of struggles. Not really when it comes to rest. It's easy to get people to rest in some way, but you've probably seen the struggles of trying to get children to do things that they do not want to do, okay, and getting them to eat things that are good for them. Those are real obstacles in life, and it's a task of the parent to do this. All right, the next category is maintenance, and that has to do with taking care of the things that you have. All right, taking care of the things that you have usually involves cleaning of some kind, but it also involves repairing things as they decay and break down. All right, maintenance in life. This is probably in the category of doing things that you do not want to do. All right, and you're not being compensated for this like you would be compensated if you were performing work. All right, so it's in a different category. And a person needs to learn how to take care of the things that they have, or in general, they don't have things. It usually works out that way, that they didn't take care of their stuff, they didn't take care of their home, they didn't take care of the things that were important to them, and so they broke down, they decayed, they gave up in a lot of ways, and then you just don't have them anymore, because it just becomes trash at best. So this is a way of describing what it means to be an adult, and this is a way of describing the responsibility of the parent and the responsibility of the child. You need to learn how to rest properly, you need to work, you need to eat, and you need to do maintenance. Okay? Now, again, if a child does not learn these things when they become an adult, then they will be confronted with these things when they are an adult. And they are going to experience, the consequences of failing to function in a good way. All right? So that's a way of understanding the importance of this, that parents, if you're going to relate to your children on this basis and you want them to obey you, then have them obey you for one of these 4 categories or one of these 4 reasons. All right, that's verse 1. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with you and you may live long on the earth. All right, for you to live long on the earth and for it to be well with you, those are the categories you need to address. Those are the ones that you got to deal with. Are you resting properly? Are you working properly? Are you eating properly? And are you doing proper maintenance? Okay, and you fathers, this is verse 4, and you fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord. All right, now bringing someone up in the training and admonition of the Lord requires a parent to know the Lord. All right, that's going to be necessary. You want to bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord, you're going to have to know the Lord yourself properly. There are many different points of view about what it means to know the Lord. But if you don't know the Lord, you're not going to be able to train your children according to the Lord. All right, now you have to remember that your children are people. They have their own minds, emotions, and they have their own will. And they get to decide what they're going to believe and what they're not going to believe. So even though you may encourage your child to know the Lord, they may not want to know the Lord. And God allows people to live on his planet, at least for a while, who reject him. He allows for that. You're going to have to allow for that too if there's going to be peace between you and your child. You're going to have to allow for that. The way that, I have children, the way that I've related to my children was that, I made it clear to them, look, I want you to believe everything that I believe. But you're going to, if you do that, you're going to have to believe for your own reasons. I've got mine, but you're going to have your own. And in that way, I have been very clear about what I do believe about the Lord and, what I know about him and what I think that they should know about him. I've been very good at communicating that. And I've allowed them the freedom to decide if they want to believe that or not. All right? And our relationship does not depend on them believing these things. It depends on other things. I have other 4 categories to work through. Are we resting? Are we working? Are we doing maintenance? Are we eating? Those are parental things that I was able to focus on. To bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord has its limitations. Okay, the parent is expected to teach their children about how to be an adult and about about knowing the Lord. That is a responsibility that has been given to us. Children, teach your parents, as the commandment says. And this is right. This is a good thing. In order to do that, you're going to have to know that kind of stuff really well yourself. Otherwise, what you convey may not be so useful, may not be so productive. All right, so the father is expected to do this more than the mother, and there are a lot of reasons for that. You will find that statistically even that in general, more children will become Christians who have a believing father and an unbelieving mother. It's kind of a strange phenomenon, but there tends to be more children who become Christians as they become adults in that kind of a household. And that's just a basic statistical evaluation. You can look into that yourself. I'm just letting you know that you could research that It's something that you could pursue if you would like. I ran into these statistics a long time ago, I think 2 or 3 decades ago. And so maybe things are a little bit different now, but that's how things were as I first came to know the Lord and was growing in my relationship with Him. All right, so now fathers are generally given this responsibility more than mothers, but you see, mothers are definitely participants, and it is expected that the fathers would convey to the mothers what would be expected, and so that they will contribute to helping the children reach the standards that not only the world would be expecting, but God Himself would be expecting. That tends to be the responsibility of the father. Now, of course, if they don't have the corresponding authority to do that, then it's not going to happen. There just simply will be failure, and that's just the end of it. So they every responsibility that a person has to be properly. There has to be proper correspondence between the responsibility and the authority in order to fulfill that responsibility. He speaks about fathers provoking their children. Okay, this can be viewed in a number of ways. The first way that I like to approach this is to say that it's important to recognize that there are several problems that need to be solved as a part of our lives. Okay, that life can be described as solving a set of problems. Children are being confronted with problems. Parents are being confronted with problems. Adults, they're being confronted with problems all the time, and they need to solve the problems that they are confronted with. If the father does not help the child to solve the problems that are presented to them, then there can be an opportunity to just provoke them. Expecting someone to do something that they can't do will provoke them. And so there has to be a participation such that not only are you going to do what you can do, because I will explain how to do that, but you are expected to do those things that you can do and that you can learn how to do. That if you can learn how to do something, you are expected to learn how to do that and to do that. Okay, and these are going to be things that you probably don't want to do, but they have to be done as part of maintaining our lives, of maintaining the life that we have. So when it comes to provoking children, this can happen easily from fathers when they give problems to their children to solve, but they don't help them with what they need in order to solve it. That's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is to consider an emotional response from the children in the sense of anger. All right, the provocation usually inspires a response, which is going to be some kind of anger. And this anger will usually come from fear, all right? The fear of not being able to solve a problem, or the fear of being confronted with a problem that cannot be solved, can make a person angry. And so don't scare your children, all right? Don't put the fear of God into them, as it would be said in some cases. That just inspiring fear is not going to be useful. It's just going to provoke them. And so, that's not going to be a functional technique in most cases. Although in some cases it can solve temporary problems, but again, that's what it is. It's a temporary problem. Or let me say it differently. It's a temporary solution to a long-term problem. And for them to resolve the problem in a long-term manner, to resolve things well, there's going to have to be a different kind of solution model. Just terrorizing people into submission is maybe useful for a short period of time, but definitely not in the long term. All right, and so using fear to provoke children is something that fathers and mothers should avoid, if possible. Now, that doesn't mean that the world isn't scary, because it is. the world is scary, and there are some problems that are really scary, But the difference from what I'm describing is that if the scary problems are presented, you should include, well, what are the things that you can do about this kind of scary scenario or situation or something that's going on in the world? How does it affect you? What can you do? So while there are lots of situations and circumstances that are scary, the intent of the parent needs to be to recognize the existence of that and to remain focused on problem-solving techniques, healthy, functional problem-solving techniques that don't create new problems through the solutions, okay? Which this can often be quite a challenge for some people. All right, so that's the way that he describes the relationship between the parent and the child. From there, he talks about the relationship between a servant and a master. In verse 5, bondservants, be obedient to those who are your masters, according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in sincerity of heart, as to Christ, not with eye service as men pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, with good will doing service as to the Lord and not to man. All right, so there's a lot that can be said here. I'm going to introduce this topic, and then I will present more about these verses 5 through 7 in the next message. I'm just going to be able to introduce this. The way that this corresponds to the parent and child relationship, the way that this corresponds has a lot to do with abilities and resources. Children are not prepared to be an adult, and they don't have resources, okay, which they will need for creating and building life. Okay, that's just a general description of creating and building life. Requires resources and the knowledge to be able to use those resources effectively. If a person fails to learn how to obtain and use resources, okay, if they fail to do that, by the time they become an adult, they will quite likely have to rely on someone else who has resources and who knows how to use them, okay, in order to participate in the creation of life, in the building of life. I prefer to reserve the word creation for the Lord, but think about it as building life with the things that you have. All right. Now, this is not the only reason why people will go work for somebody else. Lots of other reasons, but that's a common one. It's because they don't have the resources to work with. So the relationship between a bondservant or a slave and a master at this time, the relationship was based on the master having ownership and control over resources and having relationships with others in order to trade with what is built from those resources or those resources themselves. And what they are willing to do is allocate some of the work that needs to be done to someone else. And a slave can assume responsibility to do the work that the master tells them to do, and the master will provide them with instructions concerning what work they are to do. The master will provide them with the resources in order to do that work, all right? And that becomes a relationship between a master and a bondservant, all right? Now, this is described as relate to this person as you would to the Lord. And there are some similarities, if we consider the relationship between us and the Lord. There are some similarities, but it's not exactly the same. Okay, it's not. There's a lot to be said about that. But for now, I'm just going to mention that this is often what happens. Okay, now to become a slave, especially during the time when there was slavery, and there still is slavery in some parts of the world today, this can happen in a number of different ways. One way is that a person is just simply born into slavery. You know, their parents were slaves, and then the child was born. So by default, the child is a slave of the master over their parents. All right, and the slave, the child, and the parents, they do not have ownership of resources or of property. The master does, and so they will comply with whatever the master requires of them, or the master will exit the relationship. Okay. Now, in general, the servants or slaves are not permitted to exit the relationship, but the masters can definitely exit the relationship. And the way that they would usually do that is by selling the slaves to somebody else. You know, I mean, if they're not going to be productive, if they're not going to be helpful, then don't take care of them. Don't provide them with resources. Don't provide them with a place to live, with food to eat, you know, with health care. You know, just don't do that anymore. Just sell them off. And if you want, you know, somebody else who will do what it is that you instruct them to do, then go find somebody else. You know, and you could even let them know, listen, I'm perfectly fine with purchasing you from somebody else, but I need to talk with you in advance and ask you, are you going to be okay with doing these things? If you're not, then you're not going to stick around very long. I'm going to sell you off to somebody else, and it could be worse than the situation you are in now, and it could be worse than the situation that you will be in with me. You know, when you go to somebody else, that could be a really bad situation. So maybe we could have a conversation about that. All right, I'm confident that these kinds of conversations happen throughout the course of history. All right, but a person can be born into this, and when they are born into slavery, they may not be able to ever exit that kind of relationship. In some circumstances, masters would provide the slaves with a way of exiting the relationship. All right, they would allow the slaves to have possession of some resources that they could accumulate and eventually use that in order to purchase their freedom. That was a way that they addressed that. Or to say that there would be a specific period of time and say, as long as you will serve me in the way that I expect you to for this period of time, then when that time comes to an end, then I will set you free. You know, I'll say, fine, I have obtained the benefit from what I put in to this relationship. I have obtained the benefit. Now, if we were to think about this from a modern point of view, in our current modern society that we have, we don't have slavery in our country here and in most countries in the world. What we have is we have employer and employee relationships. Okay? And for an employer to have an employee, the employer has to benefit a certain amount in order to make it worthwhile for them to be an employer, to deal with the risks of being an employer, and to deal with the work and the issues that they're going to have to go through in order to be an effective employer. They have to obtain some benefit for this, otherwise they'll just stop being an employer. Just don't do that because it's not worth it. Okay, and so by how much would we measure that kind of benefit? In general, all right, it has to be at least 5 times the value that the employee produces. Okay, so and that the employee receives. For example, if an employee produces enough work that creates enough value, if we were to put a number on it, something like $100, then they could receive compensation of $20. All right, that's 1/5. So for the employer to give this employee work, for them to do that, they have to receive $100 in value in order to give the employee $20 of that $100 of value. Otherwise, it just isn't worth it to the employer because of all the risks and all the expenses and all the complications associated with having an employee. Now, in a master-slave relationship, I would not expect it to be 5 times the value. Okay, but whatever the value is, and the reason why is because the employer is probably not dealing with as much risk or as much issues that the employer has. Because of that, they could probably get along just fine with less productivity. All right, that can be the case, and this can allow the slave to have some time for themselves, or have more time for themselves in order to increase their life in some way, perhaps being able to obtain their freedom. All right, but these are all case-by-case scenarios. I'm just giving you a general description of the relationship to understand how these relationships worked. Okay, a person is usually born into it, or they could be captured in war, all right, and not killed. It is an alternative to death. All right. Now, back in ancient times, when a war took place, the victor took possession of the other's land. All right. Now, in modern times, that doesn't seem to happen so much. But, back in these times, the war was won when one party to the war takes possession of the land, of the territory of their opponent. Okay. Now, when this happens, then the people on the land no longer have a claim, or a right to have ownership over what they had before. This is now going to be the property of your enemy. So what are you going to do? If you don't have any place to be, okay, and you probably are not going to have much food, at least not for very long. You're not going to have any resources that you can use in order to rebuild a new life. How are you going to eat? How are you going to rest? How are you going to work? How are you going to maintain the things that you have, if you have any of them? So the solution to this was to offer the enemy slavery as opposed to death. Okay, well, we will provide you with a master who will take care of you. And you can stay alive, but you're not going to have any resources, and you're going to have to be obedient, or there could be some serious consequences that result from that if you're not going to be a good slave. All right, this is a common way that slaves have become slaves throughout history. All right, they were a people who were conquered in war, and they were either absorbed as slaves or they were sold off as slaves to somebody else. So you can be born into it, you can be conquered in war, or you can enter into it voluntarily. You can present yourself to someone else and ask if you can be their slave. And this, of course, would be because you have failed to take care of yourself. You have failed to be a functional adult as your parents should have trained you to be. All right. And so this is an alternative. And that's the connection between the first part of chapter 6 and this section between verses 5 and 7. All right. Now I'm going to pause here, and I'll talk more about verses 5 and 7 in the next message, because we have to spend some time talking about, well, what does it mean to serve the Lord? If we're going to say serve somebody else as you would serve the Lord, well, what does that mean to serve the Lord? What would that look like? Otherwise, you're not going to serve somebody else as you serve the Lord. Or maybe you don't serve the Lord. So what is that going to look like? All right, these are open-ended issues that need to be better defined. Okay, so for those of you who are using this for your small groups, I have a question that can facilitate some conversation. In what ways did your parents prepare you to be an adult? All right, in what ways did your parents prepare you to be an adult? And perhaps also, what are some ways that you would have liked them to prepare you to be an adult? Maybe they didn't prepare you to be an adult at all, and that happens. So in what ways do you wish they would have? This is often reflected in the way that people will raise their children, that they will prepare their children in a way that their parents did not prepare them. Or they may prepare their children as their parents have prepared them. But either way, the responsibility never goes away. The parent still has the responsibility to teach, and the child still has the responsibility to learn. All right, I'll continue in the next message. Thanks.